Cheese here, and I've recently been falling in love with ThinkPads again. I've owned a few over the years, and specifically used ThinkPads and how you can get more value for your money out of a used ThinkPads. And so the one and only person that I could think to bring on to talk about ThinkPads is, of course, Alan Pope. Many of you know him as Popey. But before we get started, I wanted to tell you about learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter. Linux Academy provides hands-on online training in Linux, AWS, Azure, GCP, DevOps, containers, and security. And right now, we're running an annual Black Friday promotion that takes $150 off a full year of unlimited training. To learn more, visit learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter to get a full year for only $299. So how are you doing, Mr. Popey?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for asking me on. I'm not the world's biggest expert on ThinkPads, but I think you could class me as an enthusiast.
Yeah, so how did you originally get into ThinkPads? Like, what was your first one? Was it a hand-me-down or a work machine, or what was it?
So I used to do IT support for companies years and years and years ago, and I think I came across ThinkPads at some point. I worked for one of the big six accountancy firms, and some of their accountants had ThinkPads. And I liked them then because as an IT support person, you know, if you had to do any maintenance, they were easy to work on. You could take them apart easily. You could swap out the battery, the hard drive. They were just really easy machines to work on. And so that set it in my mind that ThinkPads are always this high bar for laptops from a maintenance point of view, and reliability as well. And I never really owned one back then. That was in the mid to late 90s. I never had one until working through IBM. And obviously everyone who worked through IBM got a ThinkPad. And so I got one given to me, on loan while I'm working there. And that's when I properly fell in love with it because I installed Ubuntu on it and everything just worked. And it just felt super reliable and robust, and I could lob it in my bag, and it just felt like the perfect laptop for me, for all of the reasons, robustness, ease of maintenance, everything worked, and so it just ticked all the boxes as soon as I got that one workstation ThinkPad.
Excellent. So, do you remember what model it was or what the specs were on that first ThinkPad? Because this would have been in the late 90s then?
No, this one would have been quite a bit later. So this would have been in the 2000s, around about 2004, 2005. No, later than that, maybe about 2006, something like that. And that would have been a W series. So for those who don't know, the ThinkPads have like the first letter defines the series of ThinkPad, and the W's are the workstation ones. So it was a workstation of some kind. I know it had an NVIDIA GPU, so it was quite chunky, and it was mostly sat on my desk at work. But that was the first one. So I actually went in high. I didn't get an entry level one. I got a really decent spec machine as my first one, which I think probably helped.
Yeah, I would imagine that would help. So. The workstation series, is that still the series that you kind of go along with? Is there a series that you gravitate to more on your personal buys?
Yeah, it really depends. And I mean, I have a number of ThinkPads, and they're a mixture, but they're a mixture between the X series, which are the kind of lightweight workstation, the one that's a little bit thinner, a little bit narrower. So the keyboard generally goes right to the edge of the machine. There's not like a big gap either side. Whereas the T series are more the corporate desk-bound laptops, and those are slightly wider. And then the workstation ones are the higher end ones. So I mostly got X series laptops and T series laptops, but some of them are so old that they predate that naming scheme. So they're R90 or R something. And most of the ones I've got are that I actually use are relatively modern, like I say relatively modern, we're talking within the last 8 years. But I've got a bunch that are much older than that. And those are kind of the retro ones that don't fit that naming scheme. But currently it's mostly X series and T series machines.
Right. Yeah. I've actually got one that when I purchased a vinyl cutter from a friend of mine, they gave me an old ThinkPad that was running, I think, Windows 95 or something, that actually still has a parallel port because that's what the printer needed. So I'd have to dig it out to see what it is, but it currently isn't in use. I probably will never use it again, in fact. So how many ThinkPads do you own now?
That's a good question. Is it bad that I don't know?
No, it's not.
So my main machine that I'm sat talking to you on is a T450, and that's the one I use all the time. And that's the one I sit in a docking station and I run it with 3 displays, and I've upgraded the drives in it and I've upgraded the RAM, and that's my main workhorse. I've even replaced the display with a better display. So it's like, that's the one I'm sat looking at all the time. The previous ThinkPad I had was an X220. So that dates from around 2012. My general guide is, when you're looking at the X series and the T series, the middle digit equates to the year of manufacture, roughly. So if you're trying to think how old a machine is, a 220 was made in 2012 and a 230 was made in 2013. So that gives you an idea of how old it was. Mine dates from around 2012, my X220.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually looking at some of the X220s in the X series myself.
They're great. They're really great. All of them have their flaws. None of them are perfect, but then no laptop is. I've got a couple of X61s, and the X61s are even more compact, and they've got a 4x3. They're much older. They've got dual core CPUs, and they've got a 4x3 aspect ratio display, no webcam, but they're perfectly serviceable. I've got one running Ubuntu Mate, and the desktop, once you get the desktop up and running, everything's fine. And I've got another one which is a command line only system, has no GUI on it, because you can. And those both work really well. And they've both got 6 gig of RAM. So, it's not like they're starving for memory or anything. They've got enough oomph to work.
So we're counting up to like 6 or so, at least, that you have in use?
Well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 in use. There's an X1 Carbon, which is the Ultrabook style, which my wife uses as her main machine. And the handy thing there is, because my T450 and my wife's X1 Carbon have the same charge port, this rectangular yellow port, it means that when we're sat on the sofa, we just hand each other the cable. So I don't have to have 2 chargers underneath the sofa. She has the cable for a bit and I have the cable for a bit. And then the rest of them are really somewhat older, crustier, kind of Windows 98, Windows 95, Windows XP era kind of ThinkPads. I've got a T43, which is the last model of ThinkPad that was made before IBM sold off the laptop line to Lenovo. And I've got a super thick one that's got front-firing speakers, but like grills on the front of the laptop. It's really, really thick, and that's got Windows 98 on it. So yeah, I've got a range of them, but the main ones that are actually in use on a daily basis are the X61s, the X220, and the T450.
Excellent. And the T450, you said you have 3 displays hooked up to that. Are you running those out of the DisplayPort jack?
So I've got it sat in a docking station. I picked the docking station up on eBay, and I just slam the thing into the docking station, and there are 2 external displays plugged in. One's via DisplayPort, one's via HDMI. And as soon as I slam the laptop in, I use the internal panel as the main screen, and then the other 2 displays are sat above and behind as I use the secondary and tertiary display. But thankfully, GNOME and KDE and all the modern desktops remember the layout. So when I yank the laptop out, everything just reduces back to 1 screen. And then when I plug it back in again, everything opens up to 3 screens, and I can rearrange my windows a little bit. and carry on. So yeah, my day-to-day machine has 3 displays, the laptop and 2 externals.
That's pretty awesome, man. Talking about these, and have you purchased any of these new, or do you mainly purchase them used? If someone was kind of looking to buy their first ThinkPad, is there a suggestion you would give them to look for pre-owned or buy new? What would you suggest?
Yeah, they're quite expensive, like relatively speaking. And one of the pitfalls you can fall into is buying there's a consumer grade ThinkPads, which are the E series, and I would avoid those. I mean, if you're on a budget and that's all you can afford, then fair enough. But they're nothing like what I would call proper ThinkPads. The E series ones are consumer grade, and it shows. They're not as easy to upgrade. They just don't feel as robust, and they don't have the same components.
Yeah, I can attest to that, because the first ThinkPad that I ever purchased outright was the X120E, which was the AMD GPU, or APU rather. It was not great, but I mean, it did the job for what I was using it for.
So I think that's the thing is that if you've got the budget and you can buy one new, that's great. But I personally have only ever had one from new, other than the one I had when I worked at IBM. I personally bought the X220 myself from new. And I was contracting at the time, so it was a business expense, my own company, and I paid £45, I think it was, on top of the cost of the laptop for on-site warranty, and I had to use it, I think, 3 times in the 3 years that warranty was valid, and I had to have the motherboard replaced once, and I can't remember what else, but I had other components replaced, and the guy just turns up to my house and sits at my dining room table and repairs my laptop right there in front of me. It's great. It's a lovely service. Not having to return to base and be without your laptop for who knows how long. It was really valuable. That 45 quid was the best 45 quid I ever spent on that laptop. But most of them I've bought secondhand, either through eBay, or there are various resellers that, refurbish laptops. And if you can find a reputable one that's got good reputation through, other people, or has got good online scores or whatever. But I bought them on eBay and they've been fine. I've not had any problem with buying ThinkPads on eBay. And there's so many of them because ThinkPads are so popular as business machines, and then businesses churn and get rid of hundreds of them. The market is full of them. So there's tons of these X series laptops on the market, and they don't particularly hold their value. They're not like Apple laptops where they command a high price secondhand. You can pick one up for a couple of $100 pretty easily.
Well, and it seems like from just my research recently, whenever I purchased my latest purchase, which was a T440S, that a lot of these machines are off-lease machines. So you'll find that the seller has 150 of these machines. They've sold, 40 or so. So I can attest to, buying from eBay, and so far I've had a good experience. But I think you're right. I think you just need to do your research and kind of determine if the seller is reputable enough to buy from them or not. When you're shopping for a pre-owned ThinkPad, is there a particular model you would say that you should look for nowadays? Is there, a particular combo meal per se that you should look for? I know that on my 440S, the trackpad is probably the worst trackpad I've ever used, so immediately I replaced that. But are there any tips or tricks that you would give people out there if they're looking to buy one? Maybe which model?
So I would start, if you're looking for ones that are going to be a usable workstation, it really depends on what your use case is. Do you want something for, retro fun, maybe install DOS and Windows 98 and Windows XP and stuff like that to play old retro games and have a bit of nostalgia as a spare machine? Or do you want it as an active usable machine? And if we talk about the latter, then I would say the X220 is okay, but it's a bit long in the tooth now. The CPU is Sandy Bridge. It's usable, and you can install a modern desktop on it, and it works perfectly reasonably. But you might get a good deal on a 230 or 250, I would probably skip the 240, which has the dodgy keyboard as well. So some of them have, Lenovo went through a weird phase where some of the models had a strange keyboard, which had the function keys along the top were a little bit weird, like touch buttons. And generally nobody likes those, but it's down to personal taste. You know, what your personal, some people prefer those keyboards. Most people don't. They prefer the traditional Lenovo keyboard. And the X220 has, I think, is the last one that has the older generation of ThinkPad keyboard. And then they went to the chiclet style. And then they went downhill, I think, with the 240 and the 440. And then they came back with the 450, and that's the one that's good. So if you get a good deal on a 450, so a 2015 era machine, or a 250, they're both the same age, same kind of internals. Or you want something a little bit cheaper and a little bit older, probably the 230 would be a good one to have if you want something low price, and they do show up. One of the pitfalls with the X series is a lot of them have, because they've been low-cost corporate machines, they have 1366 by 768 resolution. For some people, that's okay. That's good enough if you're just going to be browsing the web a little bit. But if you want it as a workstation, generally you probably want 1080p. And the 450s come with 1080p screens, and more modern ones do. But it's hard to find older ones with a 1080p screen. They're mostly the 768, which is a bit awful. It's usable, but it's not so good. The other thing that's worth noting is some of the T-series ones have an interchangeable battery. In fact, most ThinkPads have an interchangeable battery. You can just yank it out and put a different one in. But the difference with the T-series is they have an internal battery as well. So you can actually take the external battery off while the system is running. And for me, I love that. I have 4 spare batteries for my laptop in my laptop bag. And when I'm out, if the battery runs low, I'll just pull the battery out while it's running and put another battery in, and it will just carry on working. I don't have to shut down. I don't have to plug it into the mains. It just carries on working because it keeps running on the internal battery while you pull the external one out. And that's quite a selling point that not many laptops have. But if battery endurance isn't the main factor for you, then that might not be interesting to you. You might want something thin and light, so you might go for the X series, which doesn't have that feature.
Yeah, and I've noticed with that 440 that I have, I think it's a 3-cell internal battery, and it's great, man. I love that ability, just like you said, to be able to swap batteries. I've yet to purchase additional batteries, but I'm sure that will happen, next pay period, whenever I can offset that, so that my wife doesn't get too mad that I've been purchasing all the ThinkPad parts and pieces.
Yeah, it can. That's the downside. It can be a bit addictive. You can find yourself, well, I could just buy this docking station, and I could buy this ThinkPad branded mouse that goes along with it, and I could upgrade the keyboard, and it's very addictive.
Exactly. And the one thing for me that I was looking for when I purchased the 440 was the 1080p IPS display, because one of the things I noticed with the earlier X 120e that I had was that it had the 1366 screen, but the viewing angles were horrible. Like, you had to get it just perfect to get that kind of, best viewing angle possible. And with that IPS display, it's been phenomenal. But I purchased that, and then after purchasing that, I purchased, because it came with the i5 4300, I believe it is, immediately bought another motherboard. I bought the i7 motherboard, found that for like $40 or so. Bought the 450 trackpad, found that for $20. And then there was also an available M2 slot where I guess normally a 3G or cellular modem would go. So I purchased like 120 gig M2 drive just to kind of work as my boot drive. Are there any sort of upgrades that you commonly do to these machines, or do you try to buy it all loaded out as you see?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can get a good deal on one that's got like only 4 gig of RAM or something and spinning Rust hard drive, and then you can just replace those. Because you can be confident with certain models, anything other than the Carbon, the X1 Carbon, you can change the RAM, change the hard drive. And the hard drive on most of them is On the X series, it's usually a case of undoing one screw and the drive just slides out the side. With others, like the T series, you have to take the whole backplate off, but it's like 12 screws that get retained in the backplate so you don't lose them. And then you could just pop the drive out. It's not super hard. It's not difficult. So definitely storage. And yes, the fact that some of them have an M2 slot, like some of my ThinkPads, I have dual boot. So for example, I've got my X220, I've got Windows installed on the M2 drive for when I want to test out stuff like WSL on Windows. But yeah, storage is an easy one to do. In the X220, I've upgraded the hard drive in that, I don't know, 5 times in the 8 years I've had it, or 7 years I've had it. So it's very easy to do. And the fact that it's easy to do means I have confidence that it doesn't matter if the drive goes bang, I'll just put another one in there. Or if I want more storage, I'll just swap it. I feel confident that I can do that. The other thing that's a bit more tricky, but you can do, is replace the screen. And so my T450 came with a gloss screen, and it took me a while before I figured out, actually, I could just replace this. And there are companies that will sell the right screen for your laptop that has the matte coating or a different resolution. You have to be a bit careful because some of them have different connectors and different interfaces, but in general, it is possible to replace the screen. So if you really, you like the laptop, but the screen is getting you down, it is possible to just upgrade that component.
Now, are these third-party screens?
Yeah.
Okay, so from my research, that's really what I found mostly is, a third-party seller that's basically, selling a display that will work with a ThinkPad, but not necessarily the OEM replacement.
And that gave my T450, a new lease of life, because I was getting to the point where the screen was starting to annoy me. And I thought, do you know what? I should just go and buy another laptop because this one's, I'm resisting using it outside. Like sometimes I'll go and watch my son play football and I'll take a little chair and I'll sit while he's playing and I'll get my laptop out, tether to my phone, and I'll start working on my laptop. But if it's a bit sunny, the glare makes it almost impossible to use. Whereas now I've replaced the screen and it's now suddenly more usable again. And the other thing to note on upgrades is sometimes the manual is wrong about how much RAM a machine can take. So the spec for my T450 says that it can take 16 gigs of RAM, but it's lying. It can actually take 32. And I know this because I bought 2 16 gig sticks and put them in, and I've now got 32 gigs of RAM. So there are certain online resources I'd recommend. The best one, actually, I've found is there's one website which is ThinkWiki, and it's thinkwiki.org, and it's got all the specs of every ThinkPad. And the other one is on Reddit. There's a subreddit called ThinkPad/r_ThinkPad. And in there, you'll find plenty of conversations. There'll be people just showing off photos of their new ThinkPad, but people also having discussions about, I want to do this hardware upgrade, or, is this the right amount of RAM for this machine? Is there anyone else who's got this particular model and has upgraded in this particular way? And it's a really friendly, nice community. It's a nice bunch of people, and most of the people in there seem to run Linux. So that's also nice.
Well, yeah, and we were recently having a conversation about ThinkPads in the Jupiter Telegram channel. And one of the things that we were talking about, someone was like, well, this machine only supports 16 gigs of RAM. And I was like, yeah, are you sure? And so I just looked up the specs for the CPU that was in it, and it can support up to 32. And I couldn't see his eyes bulge wide open, but he was like, "Oh my God, dude, I never thought that this would work." I was like, "You might as well give it a try." I mean, at the price of RAM, I mean, it's a pretty inexpensive upgrade, and he now has RAM on order. So I'm looking forward to whenever he pops back in and he says that his ThinkPad now has 32 gigs of RAM.
I was really lucky. This T450 takes RAM that I couldn't swap out of any other machine because most of them are older than this. But on eBay, there were 2 different vendors selling the same 16 gig stick at the same time. And so I bought one from each of them, and they both arrived within a day of each other, and I put them both in the machine, and they're basically a matched pair. They're exactly the same. I put them both in, and now 32 gigs. It's awesome.
Yeah, and with that 440S, a little disappointing, but 4 gigs was soldered on. So in theory, I could. So I've got the 4 gigs that are soldered on, and then an 8 gig stick in there. So in theory, I could upgrade and throw a 16 gig stick in there, but I'm likely only going to get the 16 gigs, not the not the full 18 gigs that would be in the machine.
Wouldn't it go to 20? Would you not get 20 with 16 plus 4?
Yeah, my math is horrible. Thank you, Popey, for correcting my math. But yes, so I wouldn't be able to get the full RAM that would be in the machine. So I'm kind of teetering on if that's an upgrade that I want to do or not. And I have noticed too that like the 440p model actually has a socketed CPU, so you can swap the entire CPU out without actually having to do a motherboard swap, which I found to be a pretty inexpensive way to upgrade a machine as well.
Yeah, the only thing to watch with CPUs on ThinkPads is their thermal design isn't perfect. And my X220, I bought the i7, and a colleague at the same time bought the i5 version, identical in every way, just different processor. And mine overheats quite a bit. And it overheats, we think, because the thermal design doesn't allow the ThinkPad to get the hot air out fast enough. So, if you're going to be using it for like compiling code constantly, and you never want the processor to scale back the frequency, then you might want to consider that. The other problem is my 450 in a docking station. This is an official docking station from Lenovo. The bit on the left-hand side where there's a key lock and a button to power on and the eject button to pop it out of the docking station actually obscures part of the vent. So it's the thermal dynamics on this thing are worse when you put it in a docking station than when you don't. So my laptop overheats more when I'm sat at my desk. Now, part of that is going to be because it's driving 3 screens. So there's more pixels to push around, for sure. And there's more applications on and active at any one time. But still, it's a bit rubbish design to have half the vents blocked by the docking station that it's sat in. It's not great. I don't know if the modern ones do that as well. But this is the most recent one I have.
I see. Well, not the best engineering design decision, it seems. So of all these machines, and obviously you run Ubuntu and other variants of Linux on most of these machines, BIOS updates. If your system doesn't have LVFS support, is there a way that you go about, updating the BIOS, flashing custom BIOS? Have you tried any of those?
So I haven't tried any custom BIOSes. I'm always wary of bricking machines with BIOSes. So I'm pretty careful in that regard. I have seen that one of the downsides of Lenovo devices is they sometimes have whitelists in the BIOS for things like the wireless card. So you can't always just open it up and replace the wireless card with a better, faster one because there's a whitelist in the BIOS that won't let you. And that also happens with a battery sometimes as well. If you plug in a non-OEM battery, it can detect that and say your battery is dead, service center or whatever, which is not very pleasant. And I don't like that. But thankfully, I've got none where I have wanted to do that. But I can understand if people have wanted to do that, and it's frustrating that you're blocked by some flag in a BIOS somewhere. But there are guides that I've seen on Reddit, on our ThinkPad, where people have talked about what they've done to overcome these issues. And patching a BIOS is one thing. For the standard BIOS updates that come from Lenovo, the 2 main machines. I mean, most of my machines, as I've said, are ancient, and so they're never going to get BIOS updates ever. So I don't really care. But the main ones that I use, I generally also don't care because I don't know, they currently work. It's only if like there was some issue that I discovered that I actually had to do a firmware update for, if that I was experiencing, then I'd go and look for one. But I'm a pretty BIOS cautious person. I'm not I'm not like an Arch user who always wants the latest version of everything and the latest, number in the BIOS boot screen and all that. However, that said, I do have Windows on both of them, both of my modern ones, as dual boot on the M2 drive. Now, one thing that can be useful to do, whenever I receive a Lenovo ThinkPad, I always boot from CloneZilla on a USB stick, and I clone the hard drive before I touch it, so that in the event that I ever do need to boot back the original operating system, I can put it back on the drive. Or I might pull the drive out and put a different drive in. I'll always replace spinning Rust with an SSD.
Right.
And so having the old drive kicking around, or an image, on a server somewhere, or on a USB drive via CloneZilla, means that if I really urgently wanted to do it, I could restore the original image, do all the updates, and then do the firmware update, and then take it out again. But I personally, I haven't been hit too badly with that.
Okay. Yeah. And that's, the same for me. I'm very much one of those guys. If it's not broken, don't fix it. Right. So, and I don't want to run the risk of, flashing the BIOS and having some unforeseen issue and bricking my machine. I had considered flashing the BIOS, or patching it rather, to create a Hackintosh out of the 440S, because of that reason that you spoke about, the whitelisting of wireless cards. If you wanted to put a wireless card in that would be supported for macOS, you would basically have to go in and patch the BIOS for that, which is not something that you have to do, because you can always just get a wireless adapter that plugs into USB and you're off to the races. So not a huge problem there. That now that we've been talking about these ThinkPads and I run Linux on mine. Obviously, you run Linux on yours and dual boot it with Windows. Are there any features that we can expect to work or not work? I've noticed recently with the latest version of 1910, and I don't know if that's just part of the GNOME 3.34 package or not, but the fingerprint reader in mine works flawlessly, which is super awesome. Something I didn't expect to work. But is there anything that doesn't work really on these ThinkPads?
So yeah, the fingerprint reader works for me as well on my 450 and my X220. I think on more recent ThinkPads, I think from about a 470, 480 onwards, I think it might be broken. And I believe it's broken because the necessary driver for the fingerprint reader is proprietary. And the people who do the fingerprint stuff on the Linux side don't want to interface with proprietary blobs. And so that's a bit of a blocker. However, I'm told there are people working on some kind of magic voodoo shim or something that will enable that to work in the future. So I would imagine in the next 6 to 12 months, the fingerprint readers on more modern ThinkPads should start to work as well, where if they don't already, they should work. But yeah, I've got 1910 on both of mine, and the fingerprint reader works, but I think that's because they're sufficiently ancient. I mean, my T450 it dates from 2015, so it's not that ancient, but it's still like a 4-year-old laptop, and it works there. But no, I don't know. I don't know of anything else that I've not had working. All the ports work as expected. One of my laptops also has a GSM modem in, and that works. So yeah, suspend works, and more importantly, resume works as well. The camera works. Yeah, I can't think of anything that doesn't work. All the media keys work, so you can, turn the brightness up and down, the volume up and down, and all that kind of stuff with the function keys. The only thing that might be interesting to look at on newer models is Thunderbolt support. I've not looked at that because I just don't have a modern enough ThinkPad that has Thunderbolt ports, but that might be worth a look to investigate if that's something that's important to you, plugging in external GPUs or other Thunderbolt devices. I don't know how well supported that is.
Yeah, and I've had great luck. We talked about the dual batteries, the onboard battery and the detachable battery. I've also noticed that both of those report fine in Ubuntu. I haven't had any issues with those. I like to see that whenever I am running low on the detachable battery, that I can see the power level that I have left in the onboard battery, which is super convenient, so that you never really run the risk of being in a position where you can't power down or save your work or swap another battery in. So, I mean, overall, I've had a great experience with this recent purchase. One of the questions that Chris wanted me to ask is he's talking about upgrading Dylan's laptop. Is there a particular ThinkPad that you think is good for kids? Do you hand any of your ThinkPads down to your kids?
Oh, God, no. I guess, as always, it comes down to what do they want to do with it. And I know Sam has used my X220 in the past, and his primary use case back when he was using it was Minecraft. And the GPU in the Sandy Bridge processor in the X220 is a bit gutless. And, you have to lower the render distance and drop the detail. And so for gaming, these older ThinkPads are not really up to it. But something like a 230, 240, once you start getting a little bit newer, like 2015 era laptops, they can run some of the more basic games. I mean, Minecraft I wouldn't necessarily say is basic, but it's not Skyrim and Fortnite,
right?
But yeah, I think the robustness of a ThinkPad is helpful for a kid. Like, kids are like, they can, drop them, have them on their lap and, spill stuff on them. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but there are drip holes on the bottom. If someone spills a drink on the keyboard, the idea is that the liquid is routed around the motherboard rather than onto it and through, and should just drip straight out the bottom. There's a fun video I think Lenovo made a few years ago where someone just dumps an entire liter of water over a running ThinkPad and it just runs straight through and the laptop carries on running. It's not something I would recommend anyone tries, and I'm certainly never going to do it on my laptop, but it's nice to know that that's a test they do. And so for kids, like my own son has dropped a cup of juice over a laptop before, my mother-in-law's MacBook Air, and so it was ruined. Whereas you would like to hope that the ThinkPad would survive that kind of abuse pretty well. So yeah, I think the other nice thing about ThinkPads is, I mean, I go back to the repairability and the maintenance of it. If something does break, if the plastics break, you'll always find someone on eBay selling the plastic shell or the palm rest or the underside or something, or the memory slot cover. There's spare parts for these things all over the place. So even if something does break, there's, chance to get it fixed.
Right. And that's one thing that I've noticed, that they do have really good documentation and repair manuals, freely available. It's not like you have to go through some loops to try and say that you're a dealer or a vendor or something to get these repair manuals. So that's one thing that I really like about Lenovo. And it makes sense, in my opinion, for them to have drain holes for drinks. I mean, if I'm thinking about this as a business class machine, I'm sure several people have knocked over a cup of coffee or something into their keyboard. So
yeah, it's easily done.
It seems like it's a wise decision on engineering's part to try and help mitigate that. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for talking to me about all this.
No worries.
Are there any, closing suggestions or some sort of advice that you would give people if they're looking at picking up a ThinkPad? Yeah,
so we've mostly talked about like the modern era, like from year 2000 onwards, but there's still a whole bunch of older laptops that, predate year 2000 that would have come with DOS and Windows 98 and XP, and they're tremendous fun to play with as well, especially if you want to try playing old DOS-based games and stuff like that and live that retro life, if that's something that's appealing to you. But one warning I would give you is there are some models of ThinkPad which have BIOS passwords in them that you absolutely can't remove. And if you're looking for secondhand older ThinkPads on eBay or Gumtree or whatever, do make sure that you've got assurance from the vendor that you can actually boot directly to an operating system and that there's no password lock, because I made the mistake of buying a ThinkPad and it has a password on the BIOS and I absolutely can't get into it. And I've had to buy a complete replacement motherboard for a 15-year-old ThinkPad just so that I can get the thing to boot. So that's one thing to watch out for, I would say, is make sure the thing boots. Get some good photos of what it looks like when it's booted. But the nice thing is they're mostly super repairable and, easy to maintain, and they're fun to use. And despite their, 1980s industrial design that looks like it came out of a Russian military, they're delightful machines. I love them.
Well, thanks for taking the time today, Popey, to talk with me. I know I appreciate your insight, and our listeners will as well. But before we go, remember to visit learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter to take advantage of our annual Black Friday promotion to get $150 off a full year of unlimited training. To find out more, visit learn.linuxacademy.com/Jupiter to get your full year of training for only $299.